This is Washington Crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Leutze. This is George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware by Robert Colescott. This was painted in 1851. This was painted in 1975. This quintessential American painting was actually painted in Germany. This painting was made right here in the US of A. So which version is more American? Which more accurately reflects the American experience? Well, we're about to get into all of that. Art lovers, welcome back to the channel. My name is Christopher West, and here I'm wanting to make a space where we can talk about modern and contemporary art and design in a hopefully non-pretentious way. And today I want to talk about George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware. Now you may be thinking to yourself, I thought it was Washington Crossing the Delaware, and you wouldn't be wrong. But when you dive a little deeper into this painting, when you start to look beyond what most people see as an icon of American freedom and independence, you realize there's a lot more to this picture than first meets the eye. And there's an entire narrative here that seems to be missing. What a lot of people don't even realize was that this painting was actually painted in Germany. Leutze was a German-American who grew up in the United States, but had returned to Germany in 1840 to study history painting in the tradition of the European masters. And while in Germany, Leutze had been a big supporter of the revolutions of 1848 that spread across Europe and sought to remove the monarchs from power and create independent nation-states. This revolution, which started in France, affected over 50 countries, but there was no coordination or cooperation among all the revolutionaries. This resulted in many of the revolutions being quickly suppressed, with tens of thousands losing their lives and even more being forced into exile. It was in this environment in 1850 when Leutze painted his first version of Washington Crossing the Delaware. Yes, there were 3 versions, but that's a story for another day. And in Germany in 1850, Leutze couldn't paint a painting that encouraged revolution, that encouraged the different factions of revolutionaries to join forces and rise again against the monarchs. He could potentially be forced into exile himself, or even worse, lose his own life. But what he could do was paint a history painting, one that depicts a scene from 75 years ago that stealthily tries to unify the disparate voices of the revolution in Europe in the hope that the American Revolution could encourage Europe's liberal reformers. And so, in 1850, he painted Washington Crossing the Delaware. This painting was exhibited in New York in 1851 and would eventually land in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It has since been reproduced in every art history book. It's been printed on postcards and coffee mugs, posters and paperweights, and has become ingrained in nearly every American as the ultimate symbol of freedom. But we all know that freedom wasn't universal. George Washington, the actual hero in this painting, owned slaves. Women couldn't vote until 1920, and even then the Jim Crow South knew all too well how to keep African Americans from voting. Poll taxes, literacy tests, violence, lynching. Asian American immigrants weren't allowed to vote until 1943, and many Native Americans, the ones that had literally lived on this land for centuries, weren't guaranteed the right to vote until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So yes, Leutze was a history painter, but this idyllic, white, male version of history is pretty effed up, and clearly doesn't tell the whole story. But the fact is, this painting became part of the lexicon, a symbol of what it meant to be an American. It would influence all kinds of artists for the next 150 years, and continues to do so to this day. Enter Robert Colescott. Colescott was born in 1925 to a pianist mother and a violinist father. In 1942, he was drafted into the U.S. Army, where his tour of duty took him to Paris, a place that was then the capital of the art world, and where he found an environment that was more welcoming to African American artists. So after returning home from his tour and earning his bachelor's degree from the University of California at Berkeley, Colescott would spend the following year back in Paris studying with the famed French artist Fernand Léger, who would be influential in getting him to reconsider the human figure as subject matter. In the mid-60s, Colescott spent 2 years living in Cairo, where he was influenced by the narrative form of Egyptian art, by 3,000 years of a non-white art tradition. he returned to the States during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And he realized that abstraction, still the dominant art movement of the time, didn't offer the narrative scope that he sought. Colescott wanted to be a history painter. He understood that whoever paints the past shapes it, and he wanted to tell a different story than the one that dominated the history books. During the 1970s, Colescott began to repaint canonical European and American paintings, but changed some or all of the figures into racist caricatures of blackness. He would take on Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait and Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. His version of de Kooning's Woman 1 would challenge the notion that the subject matter was a universal portrayal of a woman, but it was actually a white woman. Colescott's version would ask, what are the implicit messages about black womanhood embedded in American visual culture? And this brings us to George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware. The full title is actually George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, page from an American history textbook, and it was painted in 1975. In Colescott's version, George Washington becomes George Washington Carver. Carver captains the boat, towering over 8 other figures on board. Colescott paints a rowdy cast of black characters whose caricature-like representations are clearly informed by racist popular imagery. Colescott has said his painting is about white perceptions of black people. There's a cigar-smoking banjo player, an inebriated farmer, a mammy figure, and a servant-like chef. These pejorative caricatures are immediately recognizable to the viewer as they have been widely seen and ingrained in our consciousness. Sadly, less known is the story of the professor, scientist, and inventor George Washington Carver. What I did was to take something that was admirable, mess it up, and make you question everything that the artwork stood for. Colescott boldly took an iconic image that within the public imagination represents American ideals of freedom and unveiled its inherent racial bias. Colescott was not the only artist to tackle Leutze's subject matter. Larry Rivers, the godfather of pop art, painted this version in 1953. It foretells the appropriation that would become the signature style of pop art while pushing back against abstract expressionism. It now hangs in the Museum of Modern Art. Peter Saul's version, painted the same year as Colescott's George Washington Carver, with its guns, cannons, and whizzing bullets, hangs as a cartoon with an anti-war sentiment. Kent Monkman, the Native American artist living in Canada, in Resurgence of the People from 2019, reinterprets the Euro-American tradition of history painting by inserting indigenous people and refugees in the place of conventional white male heroes. And then there's Kara Walker, who painted The Crossing in 2017. Inspired by the inauguration of President Trump, Walker's version features the protagonist leading the boat in a dunce cap, while others vomit and jump overboard. So which painting is the most American? The one painted in Germany to try and persuade European revolutionaries to unite in their common cause? Or the one painted in the United States in response to the racial tensions that dominated the era? Or maybe the one that was painted in Canada by a Native American whose ancestors have lived on this land for centuries? Not necessarily an easy question to answer, but if we can grasp the concept that our own version of history, the way we see the world, is not the same way that everybody else sees the world, then I believe we are on the right path to becoming truly American. And you know, if you've watched any of my previous videos, that as an art dealer, I'm always fascinated by the market for these works. How do you put a price on a piece of America? Well, the market spoke, and it first did so in 1851, when the version of Washington Crossing the Delaware we have been talking about first sold for the unheard of at the time and princely sum of $10,000. It would eventually be donated to the Met. But didn't I say there were 2 other versions? The first was initially damaged in a fire in the artist's studio. It was then restored and would eventually be acquired by the Kunsthalle Bremen, until 1942 when it was bombed by Allied forces. The third version, which was smaller than the other 2, remained in private hands and hung for a time at the White House. It then went on to the Minnesota Marine Art Museum, and then, In 2022, the owners decided it was time to sell, and at Christie's later that year, it went for $45 million. And what about the Colescott? It was originally sold by my former employer, the John Berggruen Gallery in San Francisco in 1976. Although it would be lent to numerous exhibitions at museums across the country, it would remain in the same private collection in St. Louis until 2021, when it sold at Sotheby's for more than $15 million. And what if you're like me and love Robert Colescott, but can't drop 6 or 7 figures on a painting? I do have this lithograph from 1989 currently available in the gallery for a lot less. If you want to check it out, I'll put a link to the website down in the description, and as always, don't hesitate to reach out via email or in the comments below. So thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again on the next one. Ciao.